Welcome to a journey into one of the most unsettling chapters of American history. Today, we venture into the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, where a discovery in 1914 deeply disturbed a community and left behind questions that still linger. Share in the comments where you are watching from and if you are familiar with the dark mysteries of West Virginia. This was an era when the mountains still guarded impenetrable secrets. The West Virginia of 1914 was a place where modernity had scarcely made an impact, with dirt roads and electric light being an unknown luxury for most. On the steep slopes of Appalachia, small communities lived in isolation from one another, separated by deep valleys and dense forests that seemed to swallow anyone daring to venture alone. Greenbrier County was known for its coal mines and modest farms scattered across the hills. The families living there depended on the land and each other for survival. Winter arrived early and departed late, bringing a constant mist that clung to the pine trees, transforming the landscape into something almost ghostly. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else, where secrets were difficult to keep, yet where silence could become deafening when necessary. Martha Pike was a 23-year-old woman who lived with her family on a remote property near the town of Real. The daughter of farmers, Martha was known for her reserved nature and gentle way with the local children. She assisted her mother with household chores, tended to the chickens, and spent hours embroidering by the window, gazing at the distant mountains. Her brown hair was always tied in a simple bun, and she wore modest dresses sewn by her mother. In the spring of 1914, Martha began receiving visits from a man whom no one in the family knew well. He claimed to be a tool trader traveling through neighboring counties. He was tall, with a thick beard and dark eyes that rarely seemed to blink. The man always appeared at dusk as the mountain shadows began to swallow the paths. Martha's parents disapproved of these visits, but the young woman insisted he was merely an acquaintance, bringing news from other areas. One afternoon in May, Martha told her mother she was going to town to fetch fabric from Mr. Hutchinson's shop. The walk would take about 2 hours, following a narrow trail that wound through oak trees and crossed an icy stream. Martha left with a wicker basket on her arm and a blue shawl over her shoulders. She promised to return before nightfall, but Martha Pike never came home. Her parents waited until full darkness fell. When the mountains were enveloped in night and Martha had still not returned, her father took a kerosene lantern and went out onto the path his daughter would have taken. He called her name repeatedly, but only the echo answered him, returning from the slopes like a mournful sound. The next morning, neighbors were alerted, and a group of 12 men formed to search for the young woman. They combed the trail, inspected the stream banks, and entered sections of the forest where few dared to go. Nothing was found. Neither the basket, nor the shawl, nor any sign that Martha had passed that way. The days turned into weeks. The county sheriff, a middle-aged man named Walter Briggs, conducted interviews with everyone who had seen Martha in the days before her disappearance. The tool trader who visited the young woman had also vanished. No one could say where he had gone. Some claimed to have seen him heading south toward Tennessee. Others swore they saw him near the old abandoned mines, a place few dared to approach. The community began to whisper theories. Perhaps Martha had run away with the mysterious man. Perhaps she had gotten lost in the forest and succumbed to the cold mountain nights. Or perhaps something much darker had happened on that journey between her home and the town. An atmosphere of mistrust settled in. Neighbors looked at each other with suspicion. Women began to avoid walking alone, and children were kept close to home even during the day. It was only in early August, nearly 3 months after the disappearance, that the truth began to emerge from the depths of those ancient mountains. And when it emerged, it brought with it a darkness that no one was prepared to face, a darkness we will uncover together in the next parts of this disturbing story. If you are enjoying it, please leave your like so that more people can learn about this case, and activate the bell so you don't miss any detail of what is still to come. The discovery happened in a way no one could have predicted. On the 5th day of August 1914, two hunting brothers, Thomas and Samuel Garrett, were following deer tracks on the highest slopes of Mount Sioux, a steep area covered with vegetation so dense that sunlight could barely penetrate the forest floor. The Garretts knew those lands better than anyone. They had grown up hunting with their father and knew how to identify every type of track, every sound of the woods, every sign of danger. That morning, as they followed the trail, they noticed something strange. An acrid and unmistakable odor began to permeate the humid mountain air. It was a smell any experienced hunter would recognize immediately: the smell of death. The brothers exchanged apprehensive glances, and contrary to every instinct telling them to turn back, decided to follow that funeral scent. What they found, about 300 meters from the main path, would forever change the history of that region. Hidden under a pile of dry branches and rotting leaves, partially covered by rocks that someone had clearly placed there intentionally, was Martha Pike's body, or at least what remained of it. The 3 months exposed to the elements, wildlife, and the Appalachian summer heat had taken their toll. But there was something beyond natural decay that deeply disturbed the Garrett brothers. There were clear signs that Martha had not died from an accident or natural causes. Thomas Garrett ran down the mountain to the nearest town, Real, and alerted the authorities. Within hours, Sheriff Walter Briggs, accompanied by a local doctor named Henry Morton and 6 other men, made their way up to the discovery site. What they saw there confirmed their worst fears. Martha had been taken to that remote location, a spot chosen precisely for its inaccessibility, where hardly anyone would find her. The attempt to conceal the body was evident. Someone had worked hard to make her disappear forever in the depths of those mountains. Dr. Morton, a man who had served as a military medic in previous conflicts and had seen his share of horrors, conducted a preliminary analysis right there under the thick shade of the pine trees. His findings were recorded in a leather notebook that would later be filed in the county records. Martha had suffered brutal violence. There were signs of trauma to the skull, fractures indicating blows delivered with considerable force. Her clothes, or the pieces that remained, were torn and scattered around her body. The blue shawl she had worn on the day of her disappearance was found a few meters away, caught in a bush, stained and deteriorated. The news spread through the community like wildfire. Martha Pike had not run away. She had not gotten lost. She had been murdered, and whoever had done it was still somewhere nearby, perhaps watching, perhaps planning an escape, or perhaps already too far away to be caught. The existing fear turned into panic. Families locked their doors even during the day. Men began to carry rifles wherever they went, and the question everyone whispered was always the same: who had done this to Martha? Sheriff Briggs was not an experienced homicide investigator. In 1914, West Virginia did not have the forensic resources available today. There were no laboratories for evidence analysis, no detailed crime scene photographs, no criminal databases. Everything depended on testimony, intuition, and a bit of luck. Briggs began reviewing everything he had gathered during the 3-month search. He went back to questioning people, and he always returned to the same name: the mysterious traitor who visited Martha and who had vanished at exactly the same time. But no one knew this man's real name. He had introduced himself only as James. He had left no address and had no known family in the region. There were no records of him in the books of local inns or hotels. It was as if he were a ghost that had emerged from the mountains, fulfilled its dark purpose, and vanished back into the Appalachian mists. Some travelers passing through the region were questioned. A street vendor said he had seen a man matching James's description near the Kentucky border weeks after Martha's disappearance, but the trail ended there. Meanwhile, local newspapers began covering the case. The Greenbrier Independent published a full story dedicated to the murder of Martha Pike, describing the young woman as a gentle soul who had fallen victim to an incomprehensible evil. The article called for justice and demanded action from state authorities. Other newspapers in surrounding counties reproduced the story, each adding their own speculations and theories. The Martha Pike case quickly became known throughout southern West Virginia. But while the press speculated and the community demanded answers, Sheriff Briggs faced a wall of silence. There was something people weren't saying. He sensed it between the lines of conversations, in the averted gazes, in the long pauses before answers. Someone knew more than they were willing to reveal, and this certainty consumed him. The truth was there, hidden in the mountain shadows, waiting to be discovered, and soon an unexpected revelation would bring to light secrets that many would have preferred to remain buried forever. Stay with us to find out what happened next in this dark tale. The turning point came from an unexpected source. In late August, an elderly woman named Abigail Thornton sought out Sheriff Briggs in his small office at the Real police station. Abigail was a midwife and healer, a respected figure in the community who had helped deliver half the children in the county. Her weary eyes carried the weight of decades of guarded secrets, whispered deathbed confessions, and truths she had vowed never to reveal. But Martha Pike's death had shaken something within her. With trembling hands clutching a cup of tea the sheriff had offered, Abigail began to tell a story that would completely change the course of the investigation. She revealed that Martha had sought her services in April, about a month before her disappearance. The young woman was pregnant. She was terrified, ashamed, and desperate for guidance. Abigail had tried to calm her, offered her teas to strengthen her health, and advised her to tell her family. But Martha begged for secrecy. She said the father of the child was a man who could not acknowledge paternity, that there were broken promises and lies involved. Sheriff Briggs felt the weight of this revelation. Martha wasn't just being courted by the mysterious traitor. She was carrying his child, and that changed everything. A man wanting to rid himself of an inconvenient responsibility, to erase evidence of a scandal, would have ample reason to commit the unthinkable. Martha's pregnancy transformed the murder from a crime of opportunity into something premeditated, calculated, and deeply cowardly. Abigail revealed more. She said Martha had mentioned the man had a wife in another state, that he traveled constantly between West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, trading not only tools, but also selling land on behalf of a company whose existence no one could confirm. Martha had discovered this only weeks before her disappearance and had confronted the man. He had promised to resolve the situation, said he would leave his wife, that they would move away and start over. But they were lies. Everything had always been lies. With this new information, Sheriff Briggs sent telegrams to authorities in neighboring states. He described the man, mentioned his alleged profession, and asked them to check records for peddlers, land agents, and any individuals matching that profile. Communication technology at the time was limited, and each response took days to arrive, but slowly, pieces began to fit together. A sheriff from Pike County, Kentucky, responded to the telegram. He said he knew a man matching the description. His real name was James Edward Callahan, a 38-year-old native of Cincinnati, Ohio. Callahan had previously been investigated for fraud related to selling non-existent properties. He deceived poor families, sold plots of land that didn't exist, and disappeared before the scam was discovered. But he had never been formally charged. He always escaped before authorities could arrest him. The Kentucky sheriff attached disturbing information to the telegram. Callahan had last been seen in June, just over a month after Martha's disappearance, boarding a westbound train, possibly to Missouri or Kansas. He was carrying only a small suitcase and seemed to be in a hurry. A train station worker remembered him because Callahan had bought a one-way ticket and had insistently asked about cities where he could disappear without a trace. Briggs now had a name, a history, and a direction. But the territory was vast. The western United States in 1914 was a place where one could easily reinvent oneself, change names, and start a new life without questions. Thousands of people did this every day, fleeing debts, dark pasts, or crimes they had committed. Finding James Edward Callahan would be like searching for a needle in a haystack the size of half the country. But the sheriff wouldn't give up. He sent detailed descriptions of Callahan to police stations in Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, and even California. He included information about his previous scams, the murder of Martha Pike, and the urgent need to bring him to justice. The months dragged on. Autumn arrived in Appalachia, painting the mountains in shades of red and gold. The leaves fell, covering the paths where Martha had last walked. And while nature followed its eternal cycle, the Pike family remained without answers, without justice, and without peace. It was in November, when the first intense cold began freezing the mountain streams, that unexpected news arrived. A telegram from St. Louis, Missouri. Local authorities had arrested a man trying to sell fraudulent land to newly arrived German immigrants. During interrogation, the man initially identified himself as John Miller, but his fingerprints, when compared to records of previous arrests in other states, revealed his true identity. He was James Edward Callahan, and finally, after months of searching, Martha Pike's killer was in custody. But bringing Callahan back to West Virginia would be just the beginning of an even more difficult battle. Keep following to find out what happened when he finally had to answer for his crimes. The extradition of James Edward Callahan from Missouri to West Virginia took nearly 6 weeks to complete. The legal processes of the time were slow and bureaucratic, involving judges from multiple jurisdictions, lawyers who appeared out of nowhere offering representation, and a mountain of paperwork that needed to be signed, stamped, and sent from one state to another. Callahan tried to resist extradition, claiming that Missouri had jurisdiction over the fraud crimes he had committed there, and that he should be tried first in that state. His lawyers argued that he had never been to West Virginia, that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. But Sheriff Briggs had done his job meticulously. He gathered witnesses who had seen Callahan visiting the Pike property. He obtained signed statements from local merchants who remembered selling provisions to him. And more importantly, there was Abigail Thornton's testimony about Martha's pregnancy and the confessions the young woman had made about the child's father. Everything pointed to Callahan. All the pieces fit together in a dark and inescapable way. In January of 1915, 9 months after Martha's death, James Edward Callahan finally arrived at Real, handcuffed and escorted by 2 federal marshals. News of his arrival spread quickly, and a crowd formed outside the police station. There was anger on those faces. There was pain. Entire families had come, some traveling for hours across the icy mountains, just to see the man who had taken Martha out of this world. Martha's father, a man who seemed to have aged decades in a few months, stood there silently, his eyes fixed on the door where Callahan would be taken. When Callahan stepped out of the carriage that had brought him from the railway station, the crowd erupted in shouts. Some people were crying. Others screamed for immediate justice. One man tried to advance towards the prisoner, but was restrained by others. Sheriff Briggs had to form a human barrier with his deputies to ensure that Callahan made it to his cell alive, not because he wanted to protect him, but because he knew that justice needed to take its proper course. Lynchings were not uncommon at that time, especially in small communities where emotions ran wild and patience with the legal system was limited. Callahan was not what many expected. He wasn't an obvious-looking monster. He was a man of average height, with ordinary features, that could belong to any traveler or merchant. His eyes, however, carried something cold, somewhat calculating. Even handcuffed and surrounded by people who wished to see him dead, he kept an almost indifferent expression, as if it were all just a temporary inconvenience. This coldness deeply disturbed those who witnessed it. He was the face of banal evil, of a man capable of committing atrocities and then sleeping peacefully at night. The trial was scheduled for March. During the 2-month wait, Callahan remained in the county jail, a red brick building with only 6 cells that was at the back of the police station. He ate his meals in silence, rarely spoke to the guards, and spent his days lying on the narrow bed in his cell, staring at the damp, stained ceiling. When his lawyer visited, they talked in whispers that no one else could hear. The defense strategy was being carefully constructed. Meanwhile, the county's district attorney, a young lawyer named Thomas Whitfield, worked tirelessly to build the case against Callahan. Whitfield was only 30 years old, but he was known for his dedication and his ability to present clear arguments, even in the most complex cases. He knew he had no direct physical evidence. There were no eyewitnesses to the murder. There was no confession. What he had was a series of circumstances that, when connected, painted an inescapable picture of guilt. Whitfield interviewed dozens of people. He talked at length with Abigail Thornton, preparing her for the testimony she would give. He spoke to the Garrett brothers, who had found the body. He consulted Dr. Morton about Martha's injuries and what they suggested about the way she had died. Every detail was noted. Every statement was verified and reviewed. He couldn't give Callahan any loopholes to escape. The entire city seemed to be in suspension during those winter months. The conversations in local businesses always revolved around the imminent trial, speculation about what would happen, about whether Callahan would be convicted, about what punishment would be appropriate for such a heinous crime. West Virginia still practiced the death penalty by hanging, and many in the community believed that this would be the only acceptable justice for the man who had murdered Martha Pike and the child she was carrying. But there were also those who doubted, who whispered that perhaps there was not enough evidence, that a good lawyer could create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors, that Callahan could somehow escape the punishment he deserved. These doubts kept everyone awake at night, fearing that justice might fail once again. And as winter slowly gave way to spring, as the snow melted in the mountains, and the first green shoots began to appear, the date of judgment drew inexorably closer. The final showdown between the truth and the lies of James Edward Callahan was about to begin. Follow us to find out what happened in that courtroom and whether justice finally prevailed. The 15th of March of 1915 dawned cold and gray over Real. A dense fog covered the dirt streets and clung to the roofs of the modest buildings that formed the center of the city. The county courthouse, a 2-story building with tall windows and a creaking wooden staircase underfoot, had never received so much attention. From the early hours of the morning, people began to crowd outside, waiting for a chance to enter and witness the trial that everyone had been waiting for. The courtroom had a capacity of approximately 80 people seated, but that day, more than 150 tried to enter. Justice Harold Peaton, a 62-year-old man with long gray hair and a reputation for severity, ordered that only those with seats could remain. The others would have to wait outside, where reports of what happened inside would be transmitted by anyone who could hear through the open windows. The Pike family occupied the front row. Martha's father, wearing his only dark suit, sat with the rigid posture of someone trying to contain a pain that is impossible to describe. By her side, her mother held a white handkerchief that she constantly twisted between her fingers. Martha's younger siblings, 2 boys aged 17 and 19, flanked their parents as silent guardians. Their faces showed a mixture of pent-up anger and fragile hope that they would finally have some form of closure. When James Edward Callahan was brought into the room, absolute silence fell over everyone present. He entered escorted by 2 deputies, wearing simple but clean clothes that his lawyer had provided. No chains or handcuffs were visible during the trial, a decision the defense attorney had insisted on to not negatively influence the jury. Callahan walked to his chair with measured steps, sat down, and looked briefly at the crowd before fixing his eyes on the table in front of him. He showed no emotion. The jury was made up of 12 men from the region, all farmers, merchants, or coal mine workers. They were men who knew the hardships of life in Appalachia, who understood the value of honor and the word given. Men who had probably crossed paths with Martha Pike at some point in their lives. Jury selection had taken a full day, with the defense counsel rejecting anyone who admitted to having ever formed an opinion on the case. Prosecutor Thomas Whitfield began his presentation with a detailed reconstruction of Martha Pike's final days. He described the young woman she was, her modest dreams, her simple life on the family farm. Then, in a firm voice but charged with restrained emotion, he presented to the jury the figure of James Edward Callahan, the itinerant merchant who had seduced Martha with empty promises, and then, when she became a problem that could ruin his reputation and expose his crimes in other states, decided to eliminate her. Whitfield called Abigail Thornton as the first witness. The old midwife climbed onto the dais with difficulty, leaning on a cane. In a trembling but determined voice, she repeated everything she had told the sheriff. She talked about Martha's visit in April, about the young woman's despair when she found out about her pregnancy, about how she had mentioned the father of the child, and his promises that everything would be resolved. The defense attorney tried to discredit her testimony by suggesting that Abigail might be mistaking Martha for another patient, but the woman was firm. She remembered it perfectly. There were notes in her birth and consultation diary. Then came the witnesses who had seen Callahan visiting the Pike estate during the spring. A neighbor passing by the main road testified that he saw the accused leaving the house at dusk on at least 3 occasions. A merchant in the town said he had sold tobacco to a man matching Callahan's description, who had mentioned that he was passing through but visiting an acquaintance nearby. Each testimony added another layer of circumstantial evidence. The most impactful point came when Thomas Garrett, one of the hunters who found the body, was called to testify. He described in disturbing detail the scene they had encountered that August morning. He talked about the clear attempt to hide the body under branches and stones, about the distance of the place from any known trail. His voice choked when he mentioned the state in which Martha was found, and several people in the audience began to cry silently. Dr. Henry Morton presented his medical findings. He explained to the jury using simple terms the types of trauma Martha had suffered. He confirmed that she was approximately 3 months pregnant when she died. He estimated that the death had probably occurred on the same day as her disappearance, based on the state of decomposition when the body was found. His analysis suggested that Martha had been taken to that location while still alive, where the attack took place. There was no accident. There was no possibility of defense. It was an act of premeditated violence. The defense lawyer tried to create doubts. He argued that no witnesses had actually seen Callahan with Martha on the day of the disappearance, that there was no direct evidence that he was even in West Virginia at that particular time, that the body had been found in conditions that made it impossible to identify it completely accurately. He suggested that another man, perhaps someone from his own community, might have committed the crime, and that everyone was simply looking for a convenient scapegoat in an outsider. But his words rang hollow against the accumulated weight of evidence. The jury could see through the attempts at confusion. They could connect the dots that the prosecutor had so carefully mapped out. And when the first day of the trial ended, when Judge Peaton slammed his gavel and announced that they would resume the next morning, everyone left that courtroom knowing that James Edward Callahan's fate was being sealed. But what was yet to come in the coming days of trial would bring even darker revelations about the man who had destroyed so many lives. Don't miss the next part of this story. The second day of the trial brought a surprise that no one anticipated. Among the people who had been waiting outside the courthouse since dawn was a woman no one recognized. She wore a simple dark-colored dress and a hat that partially concealed her face. She seemed to have traveled a long distance, for her clothes were crumpled and dusty. When the doors opened, she was one of the first to enter, choosing a seat at the back of the room, away from prying eyes. Thomas Whitfield resumed his performance by calling Sheriff Walter Briggs to the dais. Briggs brought with him a stack of documents he had collected during his investigation. He described to the jury the months of searching for Martha, the red herrings, the dead ends. Then he presented the telegrams exchanged with authorities from other states. It was through these cables that the true nature of James Edward Callahan began to emerge in an even more disturbing way. The sheriff revealed that Callahan wasn't just a land scammer. He had a track record that stretched for at least 15 years across 7 different states. In each place, the pattern was similar. He would arrive in a small community, present himself as a merchant or investor, gain the trust of ordinary people, and then disappear, leaving behind broken promises and financially ruined victims. But on at least 3 previous occasions, there was something more sinister in his wake. In 1898 in Tennessee, a young woman named Sarah Brennan had disappeared after being frequently seen in the company of a traveling merchant who matched Callahan's description. Her body was never found. In 1904 in Kentucky, another young woman named Elizabeth Warren disappeared under similar circumstances. She had also been courted by a man who sold tools and land. Her body was found months later in a deep ravine, and authorities had concluded that she had accidentally fallen. But now with the case of Martha Pike, that conclusion seemed terribly wrong. A murmur of horror ran through the courtroom as this information was presented. What everyone had thought was an isolated murder born of panic and despair could actually be part of a much darker pattern. James Edward Callahan could be responsible not only for Martha Pike's death, but potentially for several other deaths over the years. A predator that moved from state to state, leaving destruction and pain in its path. It was at this moment that the unknown woman who was sitting at the back of the room stood up. Her voice, though trembling, cut through the silence. "I know who he is. I know what he did." All eyes turned to her. Judge Peaton slammed his gavel for order, but then seeing the woman's emotional state, allowed her to approach. She walked down the central aisle with hesitant steps until she reached the front of the courthouse. The woman identified herself as Margaret Callahan, wife of James Edward Callahan. She had traveled from Cincinnati, Ohio, as soon as she learned from the newspapers that her husband was on trial for murder. Margaret was 41, but she looked much older. Her face bore the marks of years of silent suffering. With tears streaming down her cheeks, she told a story that made even the toughest men in the room feel a pinch in their hearts. Margaret revealed that she had married James 20 years ago, when she was only 21, and he was 18. At first, he seemed like an ambitious and hard-working young man, but soon his true character began to emerge. He would disappear for months on end, coming back with stories about failed businesses and promises that next time would be different. Margaret discovered the betrayals, the lies, the scams. But at the time, a married woman had few options. Society expected her to remain by her husband's side, no matter how much he made her suffer. She described James as a man without conscience, incapable of feeling remorse or genuine empathy. He saw people only as tools for his goals. Margaret had tried to leave him twice. On both occasions, he found her and brought her back, promising changes that never happened. She lived in constant fear, not only of him, but of what he was capable of doing. And when she began to read in the newspapers about young women disappearing on the routes her husband took, she began to suspect the unthinkable. The defense attorney immediately objected to Margaret's testimony, arguing that she was a biased witness, an embittered wife trying to get revenge for a failed marriage. But Prosecutor Whitfield argued that her testimony was relevant to establishing the accused's character and pattern of predatory behavior. Judge Peaton allowed her to continue, but warned the jury to consider her words within the proper context. Margaret then revealed something that would completely change the course of the trial. She said she kept letters that James had written to her over the years during his travels. In these letters, he occasionally mentioned the people he met, the places he visited. And in a letter dated April of 1914, sent from somewhere in West Virginia, he mentioned a young woman on a farm who was showing romantic interest in him. He had written in a tone of cruel mockery that the young woman was naive and easy to manipulate. Margaret had brought this letter with her. She handed it to the prosecutor with trembling hands. Whitfield read it aloud to the court. Callahan's words, written in his own handwriting, confirmed his presence in West Virginia at exactly the period in question. They confirmed his relationship with a young woman who matched Martha's description. And the cruel and contemptuous tone of the letter revealed the true nature of his feelings. Martha had not been loved. She had been a conquest, a pastime, something to be discarded when it was no longer convenient. The impact of that moment was devastating. For the first time since the start of the trial, James Edward Callahan showed a visible reaction. His face turned pale, his eyes fixed on his wife with a mixture of anger and something that could be described as fear. He whispered something to his lawyer, who immediately asked for a recess to consult with his client. The judge granted 15 minutes. During the break, the buzz inside and outside the courtroom was deafening. Margaret Callahan remained seated in the witness area, being comforted by some women from the community who approached to offer support. She had crossed the country to do it, knowing that she was betraying the man she had married, but also knowing that it was the right thing to do. The courage of that woman in exposing the crimes of her own husband deeply touched all those present. And when the trial resumed, everyone knew that James Edward Callahan's fate was definitively sealed. But the drama wasn't over yet. Stay with us to find out the outcome of this dark story. By the time the trial resumed after recess, the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. What was once an accusation built on circumstantial evidence and indirect testimony had now turned into something inescapable. Callahan's letter was the missing direct connection, tangible proof that he not only knew Martha Pike, but that he was in the region during the exact period of her disappearance, and that his attitude toward her was one of disdain and manipulation. The defense attorney, a man named Richard Hastings, who had come from Charleston especially for this case, knew that his strategy had fallen apart. He tried one last desperate maneuver. He asked to cross-examine Margaret Callahan, seeking to discredit her motivation to testify. He suggested that she had kept that letter for all those years, waiting for an opportunity to harm her husband, that she might have even forged or altered its contents. But Margaret stood firm. She answered each question with painful honesty, admitting that yes, there was resentment, there was hurt, but that above all, there was the need to do what was right. Prosecutor Whitfield then did something unexpected. He asked the judge for permission to call an additional witness who was not on the original list. It was a police officer from Knoxville, Tennessee, who had traveled to Reel as soon as he learned of the trial. The officer, a man in his mid-50s named Daniel McCarthy, brought with him files on the disappearance of Sarah Brennan in 1898. McCarthy testified that he had never been able to close that case. Sarah had disappeared without a trace, but witnesses had reported seeing her with a traveling merchant in the previous weeks. At the time, he had made sketches based on the descriptions provided. He presented to the court those aged drawings made 17 years ago. The resemblance to James Edward Callahan was undeniable. The same features, the same facial structure, even the shape of the beard he used to wear matched the designs. The officer also revealed that Sarah Brennan was pregnant when she disappeared. Her family had kept it a secret out of shame, but he had found out from the midwife who had attended to her. The pattern was identical to the case of Martha Pike. Vulnerable young women seduced by promises, impregnated, and then eliminated when they became a problem. Callahan had not killed just once in a moment of panic. He had killed repeatedly, methodically, always following the same macabre script. The defense protested vigorously, arguing that the trial was about Martha Pike and not about old cases from other states. But Judge Peaton allowed the testimony, explaining that it established a relevant pattern of behavior to determine the guilt of the accused. The jury was visibly shaken. Some of the jurors looked at Callahan with expressions of barely concealed disgust. Others simply kept their eyes downcast, as if witnessing that evil face to face was too much to bear. When the time came for closing statements, Thomas Whitfield stood up and walked slowly until he stood before the jury. He didn't have to be dramatic or eloquent. The facts spoke for themselves. He methodically summarized each piece of evidence presented over the course of the 2-day trial. Callahan's presence in the region, his relationship with Martha, the letter he had written himself, his wife's testimony, the pattern of behavior that stretched for almost 2 decades. Whitfield then did something that no one expected. He asked for a moment of silence for the memory of Martha Pike. The entire courtroom was in complete silence for 60 long seconds. In that silence, everyone was able to reflect on the young life that had been brutally interrupted, about dreams that would never be fulfilled, about the child that would never be born, about the family that would never fully recover from that loss. When Whitfield finally broke the silence, his voice carried the weight of moral responsibility he felt. He looked directly at the jurors and said that they had in their hands not only the responsibility to deliver justice for Martha Pike, but also to send a clear message that men like James Edward Callahan could not continue to roam the country destroying lives with impunity, that every young woman in the United States deserved to live without fear of predators who saw human vulnerability as an opportunity, that the law, as imperfect as it was still the civilizing tool that separated a just society from chaos and barbarism. Defense attorney Richard Hastings made his closing statement with noticeably less conviction than he had shown at the start of the trial. He appealed to the concept of the presumption of innocence, reminded the jury that convictions should be based on absolute certainty and not on probabilities or suggestive patterns. He argued that there was sufficient reasonable doubt to acquit his client. But his words rang hollow, even to his own ears. He was doing his professional duty, but it was clear that even he no longer believed in the innocence of the man he represented. Judge Peaton then gave his instructions to the jury. He explained the nuances of the law, the requirements for a conviction for first-degree murder, the difference between circumstantial evidence and direct evidence. He reminded them that their decision should be unanimous and that they should deliberate seriously and carefully. Then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 16th day of March, 1915, the jury retired to the deliberation room. The wait was agonizing. The families remained in court, unable to leave without knowing the outcome. Margaret Callahan continued to sit alone in a corner, lost in thoughts no one could have imagined. Sheriff Briggs stood guard at the door of the deliberation room, preventing any attempt to influence the jurors. Hours passed. The sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the streets of Real. It was almost 7 o'clock in the evening when the door to the deliberation room finally opened. The jury had reached a verdict. Judge Peaton ordered everyone to return to their seats. The silence that fell over that room was absolute. Even the sound of breathing seemed too loud. The foreman of the jury, a middle-aged farmer named William Foster, stood up holding a piece of paper in his trembling hands. And when he began to read the verdict, James Edward Callahan's fate was finally sealed. But what happened next would shock even those who thought they had seen it all. Don't miss the next part. William Foster's voice was firm, but it carried the weight of a decision that would change lives forever. We, the jury, find the defendant James Edward Callahan guilty of first-degree murder. A collective sigh ran through the room. Some people began to cry. Others closed their eyes in silent relief. Martha Pike's father lowered his head and covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs that he had held back for entire days. James Edward Callahan remained motionless in his chair. There was no surprise on his face, no despair, no regret, just that same cold, distant expression he had maintained for almost the entire trial. It was as if he was watching something that happened to someone else, as if that verdict had nothing to do with him. This absence of emotion was, in some ways, more disturbing than any outburst of anger or denial could have been. Judge Peaton slammed his gavel repeatedly to restore order, as emotion threatened to overflow in those present. When he finally got enough silence, he thanked the jury for their service and set sentencing for the next morning. The law required that there be an interval between the verdict and the determination of the punishment, a last moment for all parties to present arguments about what penalty would be appropriate. But everyone in that room knew what the outcome would be for first-degree murder in West Virginia, especially a case with such aggravating circumstances. There was only one possible sentence. That night, real experienced moments of collective catharsis. Groups formed in the streets, in houses, in establishments that remained open until late. There were tears, there were hugs, there were conversations about justice, and about how that verdict would not bring Martha back, but at least give some meaning to her death. The Pike family received dozens of visitors who came to express condolences and solidarity. Martha's mother, who had remained stoic and silent throughout the trial, finally allowed her grief to manifest itself fully, weeping in the arms of the women of the community who surrounded her. Margaret Callahan spent that night alone in a rented room in a modest boarding house. She had done what needed to be done, but the emotional toll was devastating. She had just testified against her own husband. She had provided the evidence that would probably lead him to the gallows. There was no way to go back to Cincinnati, to go back to the life she knew. Everything had changed irreversibly. She stayed up until dawn, looking out the window at the dark mountains, wondering how her life had gotten to that point. The next morning, March 17th, the court met again for sentencing. Judge Peaton allowed the prosecutor and the defense to make their final remarks on the appropriate punishment. Thomas Whitfield argued that the premeditated nature of the crime, combined with the pattern of predatory behavior that stretched over years, justified the maximum penalty. He reminded the court that Callahan had not only taken Martha Pike's life, but also the life of the child she was carrying. 2 murders for the price of 1, as he put it grimly but accurately. The defense attorney made a final plea for clemency, arguing that the death penalty was barbaric and that even convicted men deserve the possibility of redemption through a life sentence. But his words met with little receptivity. Judge Peaton, after a brief pause for reflection, pronounced the sentence in a solemn and clear voice. James Edward Callahan would be executed by hanging. The date was set for the 22nd day of May in the year 1915, a little more than 2 months in the future. News of the sentence spread quickly, not only through Real, but throughout the southern region of West Virginia. Local newspapers devoted entire pages to the case. The Greenbrier Independent published an editorial titled, "Justice Delayed but Necessary," reflecting on how the legal system, despite its imperfections and slowness, had finally worked. Other newspapers in neighboring states also covered the story, especially Tennessee and Kentucky, where the families of other missing young women finally had some answer about what had likely happened to their daughters. For the next 2 months, James Edward Callahan remained in the county jail awaiting his execution. He received occasional visitors, especially his lawyer, who was still trying to find some legal loophole to appeal the sentence, but there wasn't much that could be done. The evidence had been overwhelming. The trial had been conducted properly, and there were no technical grounds to reverse the verdict. Margaret Callahan visited her husband only once during that period. She needed answers. She needed to hear from him directly if there were other victims besides those they already knew, if there were other families suffering without knowing the fate of their daughters. But Callahan refused to talk to her. When she entered the visiting area, he simply turned his face and asked them to take her back to the cell. Until the end, he would keep his secrets. To the end, he would refuse to give families the peace that came from knowledge, even if it was painful knowledge. As the execution date approached, tension in Real increased. Public executions were still common at that time, and there was debate as to whether it should be open to the public or carried out more privately. Judge Peaton ruled that it would be a restricted execution with only official witnesses and members of Martha Pike's family present, if they so desired. He didn't want to turn it into a morbid spectacle. Justice had been done, and now it needed to be carried out with the dignity that the situation demanded. The gallows were erected in the courtyard behind the jail. It was a simple wooden structure built specifically for that purpose. The executioner would come from Charleston, an experienced man who had conducted other executions in the state. Everything was being prepared meticulously to ensure that the execution was swift and, as far as possible under the circumstances, humanitarian. It was not about revenge, as Sheriff Briggs made a point of making clear. It was about the law taking its inevitable course. The night before the execution, a storm brewed over Appalachia. Thunder echoed between the mountains like distant drums. Lightning briefly illuminated the forested hillsides, revealing for a moment the landscape that had witnessed so much suffering. The rain poured down, washing the streets of Real and filling the streams to overflowing. It was as if nature itself was paying its final tribute to Martha Pike and all the other victims of James Edward Callahan. And when dawn finally came, bringing with it the 22nd of May, everyone knew that the dark story that had begun more than a year ago was about to come to an end. But there was still one last twist waiting. Follow us until the end. The dawn of the 22nd of May arrived shrouded in a dense fog that refused to dissipate. The storm of the previous night had turned the streets to mud, and the air was heavy with moisture that clung to the skin like an invisible cloak. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a small group began to gather in the jail yard. Present were Sheriff Briggs, Judge Peaton, District Attorney Thomas Whitfield, a local priest named Father Michael O'Connor, who had been asked to give the last rites, the executioner from Charleston, 2 deputies, and 3 official witnesses appointed by the county. Martha Pike's father was also there. He had debated with himself for weeks whether to attend or not. His wife had begged him not to go, saying that witnessing the execution would bring no peace, only more disturbing images to haunt him for the rest of his days. But he felt that he should be present. It was his duty as a father, as a protector, who had failed to protect his daughter, to ensure that justice was completely served. He was there, dressed in his dark suit, his face marked by sleepless nights and hair that had completely grayed in the last year. James Edward Callahan was brought from his cell at 7 o'clock. He had refused the breakfast they had offered him. He had also refused the presence of the priest, saying that he had no need of absolution or spiritual comfort. His last hours were spent in silence, lying on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling of his cell, as he had done all those months. When the deputies came to fetch him, he rose without resistance and walked among them with the same distant expression that he had maintained throughout the trial. Upon stepping out into the courtyard and seeing the gallows erected in front of him, Callahan paused for a brief moment. It was the first and only time that something resembling emotion crossed his face. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like an acknowledgement, an acceptance of the inevitable. He looked up at the gray sky, took a deep breath of the humid morning air, and then continued walking to the wooden steps that led to the gallows platform. The executioner, a burly man in his 40s, whose name was never officially recorded in the county papers, checked his ropes and mechanisms one last time. Everything was prepared according to the protocols of the time. The fall would be calculated to be rapid, minimizing suffering. It was not cruelty that they were looking for there, but conclusion. Father O'Connor, despite being refused by Callahan, remained standing near the gallows, murmuring prayers in a low voice. He prayed not only for the soul of the condemned, but also for all those present, who would have to carry the memory of that moment for the rest of their lives. It was then that something completely unexpected happened. When Sheriff Briggs asked Callahan if he had any last words, everyone expected him to remain silent, as he had done throughout the process. But for the first time since his capture, James Edward Callahan decided to speak out. His voice was calm, almost casual, as if he were commenting on the weather or making a banal remark about the day. He said he would not ask for forgiveness because he felt no remorse, that Martha Pike had been just one of many, and that if he had the opportunity, he would do it all over again, because that was how he saw the world. People were tools, means to ends, and he didn't understand why this was considered wrong. He spoke with a clinical coldness about how he had planned every date, every seduction, every discard, when women became inconvenient. And then, with an almost imperceptible smile on his lips, he said something that chilled the blood of everyone present. He stated that there were many more victims than anyone could have imagined, that Martha was not the third or the fourth, but possibly the 12th, that there were bodies hidden in ravines and forests across at least 10 different states, that some of the women had simply disappeared without a trace, buried in places where they would never be found, and that he would take the exact location of each of them to the grave, denying the families even the possibility of burying their daughters properly. The horror of that final confession was unbearable. Martha Pike's father stepped forward as if to advance towards the gallows, but was restrained by the deputies. Tears streamed down his face as he shouted questions that Callahan refused to answer. Where were the bodies? What were the names? How could he be so monstrous as to deny even this last consolation to broken families? But Callahan simply turned his head and indicated to the executioner that he was ready. The black hood was placed over his head. The rope was adjusted around his neck. Father O'Connor intensified his prayers, his voice trembling with the emotion of the moment. The executioner placed his hand on the lever that would open the trap door, and at 7:23 in the morning of the 22nd of May, 1915, James Edward Callahan paid with his life for the crimes he had committed. The fall was rapid. The sound of the trap door opening echoed through the silent courtyard. The rope stretched with a dry crack. The doctor present waited the necessary minutes before going up and checking for the absence of a pulse. He was pronounced dead at 7:27. 4 minutes that seemed like an eternity to all who witnessed it. The body remained hanging for half an hour, as per protocol, before being lowered and prepared for burial. James Edward Callahan was buried in an unmarked grave in a secluded corner of the county cemetery, far from the graves of respectable citizens. There was no ceremony. There was no mourning, just a grave dug in the damp earth and a body deposited in it, as if it were garbage being discarded. It was a fitting end for a man who had treated human lives with the same contempt. But his last confession left open wounds that would never heal completely. In the months and years that followed, authorities in multiple states attempted to investigate his allegations. They searched old records for unsolved cases of missing women that might correspond to Callahan's time in their regions. They found at least 7 cases that seemed to fit the pattern. But without specific confessions, and without the location of the bodies, they could never be sure. Families who had lost daughters in mysterious circumstances during those years lived with the terrible uncertainty of never knowing if their loved ones had fallen victim to Callahan, or if they had suffered different but equally tragic fates. This uncertainty was, in some ways, worse than the pain of the confirmed loss. It was a wound that could not be healed because it was never fully understood. The story of Martha Pike and James Edward Callahan has become part of dark Appalachian folklore. It was told on cold nights around fireplaces, a cautionary tale of the dangers that lurked on the secluded roads, and of how evil could use an ordinary face to conceal monstrous intentions. And though justice had been served for Martha, the shadows Callahan had cast were too long, too dark, and stretched far beyond that May Day in Reel. Stay with us for the final conclusion of this disturbing story. The years following the execution of James Edward Callahan brought slow but significant change to the Appalachian region of West Virginia. The story of Martha Pike has never been forgotten. It became part of the community's collective memory, a permanent scar on the consciousness of that place. Young women became more wary of strangers who arrived offering seductive promises. Families became more protective, and a dark awareness set in about the vulnerability that existed in those isolated paths between the mountains. The Pike family never fully recovered. Martha's father lived only 7 more years after the execution. Those who knew him said that he had died of a broken heart, that the pain of losing his daughter in that way had slowly consumed his will to live. He spent his last years working quietly on the farm, rarely talking about Martha, but everyone knew she occupied his every thought. He was buried next to his daughter in the small cemetery of the local church, a meeting that death had denied him in life. Martha's mother outlived her husband by nearly 2 decades. She became an almost ghostly figure in the community, a woman who had been broken by an unimaginable tragedy, but who continued to exist by sheer force of will. She visited her daughter's grave every week, bringing wild flowers she picked from the same slopes where Martha had walked as a child. She was said to have talked to her daughter during these visits, telling her about the events of the week, about how the world kept turning even when it seemed impossible for it to do so. Martha's siblings, those 2 young men who had flanked their parents during the trial, grew up bearing the weight of that loss. The eldest became deputy county sheriff years later, saying he wanted to make sure no other family went through what his had gone through. The younger moved west, unable to remain in a place where every hill and every trail reminded him of his sister, who had never returned home. Occasional letters arrived, but he never returned to West Virginia. Margaret Callahan, the woman who had found the courage to testify against her own husband, disappeared from recorded history shortly after the execution. Some said she had returned to Cincinnati under a different name, trying to rebuild a life away from the shadow of Callahan's crimes. Others believed she had moved west, perhaps to California, seeking anonymity in places where no one knew her past. There was never confirmation. Margaret simply dissolved into the vastness of the United States, becoming yet another ghostly figure in a story already populated by ghosts. Sheriff Walter Briggs continued to serve the county for another 15 years before retiring. He never forgot the case of Martha Pike. In later interviews with regional newspapers, he often referred to it as the most disturbing case of his career, not just for the brutality of the crime, but for the ultimate revelation that Callahan had potentially victimized so many other women. Briggs spent years trying to connect dots, investigating old cases, but he was never able to completely close those wounds opened by Callahan's last confession. The trial files were preserved in the Greenbrier County records, pages yellowed by time, with the careful handwriting of the clerks of the time, documenting every testimony, every piece of evidence, every moment of those dramatic days in March of 1915. Researchers and historians occasionally visit those archives, leafing through century-old documents, trying to understand not only what happened, but how it shaped the community and the region. The location where Martha's body was found, that remote area on the slopes of Mount Sioux, was never the same. Hunters and hikers avoided passing by. It was said that there was something heavy in the air of that place, a sadness that pervaded the very trees and stones. Over time, the forest completely reclaimed that space, covering up any physical evidence of what had happened there. But the stories persisted. Some swore they heard strange sounds when they passed by. Others spoke of a sense of being watched. They were probably just the tricks that suggestible minds play when they know the dark history of a place. Or maybe not. What was never solved, what continued to haunt investigators and families for decades, were those other victims Callahan mentioned in his last words. 12 women, he had said. Martha was only one of 12. But who were the others? Where did their bodies rest? In what deep ravines? In what dense forests? In what forgotten places had they been left? These questions have never received answers. Callahan took these secrets to his grave, denying even at the last moment any form of redemption or compassion. In the years that followed, there were attempts to identify possible victims. Records of missing women were reviewed in Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, Missouri, Kansas, and other states where Callahan was known to have been. Some families found a bitter kind of conclusion in connecting the disappearance of their daughters with Callahan's presence in the region during that period. But many others continued in terrible uncertainty, never knowing for sure whether their loved ones had crossed paths with that predator. Martha Pike's story has become a symbol of something bigger. It represented the vulnerability of young women at a time when legal protections were limited, when traveling alone was dangerous, when predatory men could move freely from state to state without efficient tracking systems or communication between authorities. The case helped spur gradual change. Identification systems began to improve. Communication between police departments in different states became more common, and a growing awareness of serial crimes began to form. Today, more than a century after those dark events, Martha Pike's story remains a disturbing reminder. The Appalachian Mountains still hold their mist-shrouded mountains, deep valleys, and dense forests. The landscape has changed little, but the people who knew Martha, who witnessed the trial, who were present on that cold May morning when justice was executed, are all gone. Time took away the living witnesses, but it left behind the records, the stories, the painful lessons about the nature of evil and the importance of justice. Martha Pike's grave still exists in the small church cemetery in Reel. The original tombstone, simple and modest, was replaced decades later by a more resistant one to time. Flowers still appear there occasionally, left by distant descendants or by visitors who heard the story and felt the need to pay their respects to a life so brutally interrupted. It is a place of stillness, of reflection, where the weight of history is felt. And so ends the macabre story of Martha Pike, a 23-year-old girl whose dream of a simple and happy life was shattered in the shadows of Appalachia. Her memory persists, not as a passive victim, but as a symbol of all the lives lost to violence, of all the families broken by tragedy, and of all the questions that remain unanswered in the dark depths of history. May her story remind us to remain vigilant, to protect the vulnerable, and to never underestimate the human capacity for both evil and the courage to confront it. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for joining us on this dark journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Appalachian history. Leave your comment telling us what you think of this story. Subscribe to the channel for more cases like this, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our historical investigations. Until the next story,